Hey everyone, welcome to another Coffee with Kittl. Today, we're talking about my favorite subject, typography. And I've got Daniel here with me, who is diving into letterpress and typesetting and a lot of the old forms that a lot of you probably don't just have at your disposal. And I mean, you can see behind him there, he has a whole workshop. And so I'm excited to start talking shop and talking type with him. But before we get into all of the nitty gritty, Daniel, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself briefly, and then give us a kind of backstory into how you got into what you're doing now. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk type here for a little bit, and especially this stuff that's a little outdated, a little harder to work with. But
Right.
I've been doing letterpress design. That's what this craft is called, letterpress design, for about 4 years now.
Wow.
And it started in the midst of 2020. We kind of had our world kind of flipped upside down. I know me and a lot of others.
Oh yeah.
And we ended up moving back to the family farm, essentially the farmland, and where I grew up at, fields of corn and soybeans and all that kind of good stuff. And I kind of needed something else to do. I'd been doing creative stuff for a long
Mhm.
time. I'd worked as an illustrator. I'd worked as a graphic designer. I was doing primarily teaching at that point, training up other designers, and it all kind of fell apart at once. And I wanted something else to do, and I wanted something that would make me available for my family, because primarily I'm a stay-at-home dad. That's kind of like
Mhm.
my most important role, and this helps support that. So this allowed me to do all those things. So it was a good season to pick up something new.
Right. And so you mentioned you had some illustration experience, some graphic design experience. So obviously you were using the digital form of type. And I think you're hitting on something that many creatives probably will get to if they haven't already, which is like, what is the like physical thing I can do, like with my hands, like the
Hmm.
actual craft, right? And what you
Yeah.
get to do is so neat with it actually being type, like printed, right?
Hmm.
Which you could do in a design tool to give you that instant gratification, of course, but then to see it like happen actually with metal and ink and happening touching paper and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
why don't you give us like a a play by play of what drew you to this specifically? Like where did the desire for letterpress come from? Like, was it the historical significance? I just bought a book. Actually, it's a fantastic book on the history. Basically, I think it's called like 500 or some odd 100 years of letterpress and printing or something
Oh,
like that, or
cool.
the printing
Hmm.
press. It's a great historical walkthrough of the kind of misconception that like Gutenberg started everything when it was really
Oh, yeah.
just his kind of like iconic machinery that helped spark. You know what I mean? So anyway,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what drew you to this, and give us a little backstory on it.
Yeah. So I think it was a really natural progression looking back. It was fairly unexpected when it all happened. But when I was working as an illustrator, I remember when I first started, I wanted to do everything in natural media because I
Hmm.
loved textures and I loved accidents and dry
Right.
brushing and collage and all those kinds of things. But I was really frustrated with my skill level. Like I was not able to make the things that I wanted. I had a vision in my head and was not matching up. And so that's when I switched over to vector, and this was like a godsend. It suddenly opened everything up for me. I could finally make the things because I could constantly fiddle with stuff, right? I could endlessly nudge curves and replace things and copy and paste.
Oh yeah.
And so that was really what kind of broke open my career for me, that flexibility. But the longer I did it, the more I realized that my primary like inspiration was mid-century illustrators and
Hmm.
mid-century designers. And they're working in natural media, right? They're working, maybe photostats or optical changes, or they're doing paste up stuff, or it's all happening by hand. And they're doing real illustration, with like ink and paints and mistakes that cost a lot, right?
Yeah. Oh
And I
yeah.
liked that. And what I ended up doing was faking a lot of that. Started with, finding some textures online and stuff that I could integrate with Illustrator or Photoshop. And then I started wanting more control, and I started making my own textures and, having pieces of paper laid out on tables and making all these different kind of dry brush things and working with sponge and all kind of stuff. And then you scan it and
Mm.
maybe auto trace it. And it just came to this point where I was like, I need to do this for real. If I want mistakes in my work, I need to do it for real. And so I started teaching myself how to paint like this. And I started
Okay.
shifting my career in that direction. But at the same time, that wasn't necessarily driving a lot of work for me because it's not as flexible. It's not as good for clients. And so I was really into it. I was really invested, but maybe it wasn't the best career move for whatever reason.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I was discovering a real love for type. I was discovering a love for like the grid and the system. And I was figuring out that I was a little bit better, I think, at showing people how to design well. Because there's a lot of systems, there's a lot of foundations and kind of like a lot of scaffolding that can happen. Whereas sometimes being an illustrator is almost more like an athlete. If you want to run the 100 faster, you just run more, right? You just
More.
keep doing it,
Yeah.
doing it, doing it. And that is what develops the skill. Whereas in design, there's kind of a different aspect that's a little more systems driven, maybe not in a intellectual, but maybe more academically oriented, right? And that you can learn ways to progress through this and become a better designer. And taste plays into both of those, of course. But I was just in this world of like, I like texture and I like accidents and I like mid-century. And now I'm really liking type and font design and order. And that had kind of gotten me onto the path of letterpress. I started watching videos and thinking workshops that I could do. This would kind of be like maybe the next thing I would want to investigate if I had the chance. But I didn't have the chance. I was busy doing everything else. So
Right.
I just kind of tucked that away and I kept waiting for an opportunity. And then I had an opportunity and I had a lot of time. And it was kind of funny. It almost seems preordained, but my first print I made, which was kind of on a bit of a whim, I made this giant thing. It was like 3 by 4 feet. It was like my first real print.
Wow.
And it was here. I've got one of the blocks. I'll show you one of the blocks. I got one over here. So these things are massive. I took a historic specimen and I just started carving these things out of
Oh, wow.
linoleum. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did a whole lockup on a piece of plywood. It was very improvised, but I
Yeah.
learned a ton and I put these on Instagram and they sold and I couldn't believe it. It was,
Wow. Really? How
yeah.
many did you make?
I think it was an edition of 18 that I made. And it was the steepest learning curve maybe that I've ever gone through.
Wow. That is
But it was
insane.
messy and it was textural and it's tactile and people were digging it. And I sold some and it was enough to encourage me to like, maybe this is something I could do. Maybe this is what the next step is. And when we relocated, there was an old friend who was an art teacher who had this barn full of like all kinds of equipment and materials and all kinds of things. He said, "Hey, I saw this thing you were doing on Facebook. And I've got an old tabletop press and a couple drawers of type. If you're interested and you'll use it, they
Wow.
are yours."
That's
And
incredible.
I know it was like out of the blue and it was like right in the direction
Yeah.
I wanted to go. So I got the van over there as fast as I could and I loaded it up. And I remember being slightly embarrassed because I knew I wanted to do this thing, but I didn't have the vocabulary yet to talk about it. Right. I didn't have the
Mm.
expertise and he wants to talk about things. And I was barely ready for it. But I brought it home, and the first print I made, I actually didn't even have the press set up. I used magnets and attached type to the back of a cookie sheet, and I hand inked it, and I just, kind of rubbed the paper on there, and that was the second print, and I put that on Facebook, and it sold, and people bought those. I was like,
Wow.
I may have something here, and so from then on, it was just learning the craft. Lots of time reading internet videos, Facebook groups, all that kind of stuff. But it was very unexpected, but it seemed like it was ready for this season, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it sounds like even in the, let's say, consumer behavior, we've at least what you're experiencing is people still desiring that tactile, physical, grungy, weathered piece,
Mm-hmm.
right? Versus
Yeah.
a clean printed poster, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. Clearly you have posters
No.
behind you that are,
Mm-hmm.
of that.
Yeah.
But the I guess like the organicness of it is kind of like
Yeah.
what you're saying is like and as well as it being custom or kind of a one-off or like, and then like you're saying, the amount of craft that you put into it. And what's interesting is I mean, again, I didn't know what to expect in asking you that question, but you were saying that you started these first kind of projects as in like, okay, what's like the best way I can do this? Because you didn't have you were like, how
Yeah.
do I do a press without a press? Is that is
Uh-huh.
that is that
That is
right?
exactly the question. And how do I do it huge and make it
Yeah, you
consistent,
went
you know?
way massive when I feel like people would do like maybe like a note card or like
Yeah.
a little postcard size, right?
Yep. But sometimes you're just in a moment where you want to go big and go home, and you want to try something, and if you fail, at least you tried something exciting, right? And I think
Hmm.
that was the stage I was in at that moment, and it was hard work carving all those blocks, and I was a sweaty mess after inking this thing. It was just a ton of square inchage to get ink on and pressure on, but it worked.
Goodness sakes. Okay, and so now let's move to now you have the press, right?
Hmm.
From your friend or your art
Yeah.
teacher.
Hmm.
And that was about how long after you had started uh getting into
Uh,
letterpress?
I would say that was only um, I would say from the moment I started carving those first letters, which was like the spark, I would say it was 6 months later, probably,
Okay.
that
So
he got a
now
hold of me.
walk okay, so now walk through what you did having the press. What did you do to is that where it really got into like you were saying you didn't have the vocabulary, the knowledge, or the
Hmm.
maybe the historical significance off the cuff to kind of talk about. What did you do first? Did you go and you started educating yourself? Did you just like be like, okay, well, this looks like the lever here, so I'm going to put this type here, and I'm going to like, all of us like to play with our
Yeah,
new toys, right? Like immediately,
yeah.
but what walk me through that process, now having the actual press.
So this first press, fortunately, was what's called a proof press, or this one's called a sign press. So it's a flatbed thing, where everything can get locked into this press. There's a nice grid that's been etched into it, and
Okay,
there's some ways to straighten type on and that kind of thing. And then you're hand inking, and you set your pressure, and then you manually pull the lever over it.
so that it
So it's
comes
not
down. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not a hugely complex machine,
Okay.
um, but it was still hard enough. I mean, I would say it still took me 6 months to really understand how to get the
Mm,
paper pressure just right and to understand how much work there was that went into making a good design. There's a lot of differences in type height. So when you're working with wood, and you've got to find ways to make it all the exact same height. What you're doing is shooting for everything to be 0.918 inches high, and if it's all
okay.
that, then everything presses uniformly. Otherwise, you
Nicely.
have
Yeah.
letters drop out, or you have weird
Mhm.
textures and spaces. And so figuring out that make ready process was essential to making the design work and getting the press with eye pressure. Those little bits and pieces there, that was a lot of it. There was things with fiddling with paper and different inks along the way, but those weren't huge challenges, right? It was the actual getting the design on the paper.
Yeah. And so that is mainly what your or what you have are these wood or the wood type
Hmm.
setting blocks, or did you
Yeah,
eventually move to metal, or what did? Because I'm
yeah.
assuming you must have got another press at some point because you do some stuff that's quite small as well.
Yes. Yep. I got another press last year, in January of last year, that was an absolute mess. It was a Facebook Marketplace find that
Yeah.
I got for a good deal, and I bought the thing sight unseen, and I think I'm glad I didn't see it before I bought it because it was a bit of a disaster. So it took me about 6 months to strip the whole thing, fix some things, replace some parts, and get it rolling again. But it's one of those foot powered ones, and I can run
Oh,
7 by 10
wow.
or maybe 8 by 10s on it. It's a little more finicky, just because you can adjust things more print to print on the proof press. But when you start going on the treadle powered one, you really got to have everything kind of dialed in, because once you start going, you want to keep moving. You don't want to keep stopping a lot, and waste time and paper and ink essentially.
Right.
But
So
so
yeah,
you're asking about
what
wood type, right?
the The type, yeah, the type blocks, yeah.
Yeah. So I only work with wood. Okay. So
Okay.
there's an example of a
Hmm.
wood block. Okay. And they're in all kinds of different sizes. I've got some, I guess this is some nice stuff right here. This is Clarendon. There's a 7 that goes with it. And you can actually see on the back, there's different wear patterns. And that's from the planers, the way that they were made. And that's a way you can identify type. Um, but the issue is when I'm working with this, most of this stuff is damaged in some way, or you don't have a complete
Mm.
font. So
Set.
you
Yeah,
end
you
up,
don't have a set. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, you don't have that right distribution of characters. So I have a couple solutions. So like this is the X I just showed you. I needed a second one of these for a layout. And so what I did is found a specimen online, and I trace it and I carve it out of linoleum. And then this is
Wow.
3/4 block with linoleum on it, and then this little piece of chipboard on the back. And that basically gets them up to the same height. And if there's
Hmm.
any, you can see there's a little bit of difference there. I'll just
Sure.
slip literally a piece of cardstock underneath with a torn edge
To lift it
sometimes
up. Yeah.
to lift it up, and that'll make all the difference. So there's a lot of that going on. I try not to carve too many things, um, simply because it takes time,
Takes
right? But
forever, I'm sure.
yeah, it does. It does. But sometimes I do have a laser engraver. Sometimes I'll cut stuff. So this is one I did for our local state park. You can see that. So this one I
Wow.
designed
Yeah.
digitally, and then I engraved it because this is negative. So what happens is the wood around it prints, but not the letters. And that way I can see
Hmm.
through to the paper. I can't do that with traditional type. There's a couple fonts like that, but not customized like this. But I try to make it relate to what I've already got in my type cabinet, what I'm already working with. So all these are fonts that I'm already using, and that way it kind of plays into my portfolio and style. Right. This is a
Yeah.
really old one called Divini, which I have a case of. So just trying to stay consistent instead of there's so many fonts out there. I could have a great time cutting everything I want, but it takes time and energy and resources when you make something. So you just want to make sure it's the right move, right? When you're
Yeah.
making stuff.
So, a couple follow up questions from
Yeah.
that. When you are doing the press, I've noticed that a lot of your designs may also have multicolor,
Hmm.
or they may have an illustration involved as opposed to just type. What
Yeah.
are you doing to, if we just kind of use the word layering, right? So
Hmm.
this is a layered design of some
Yeah.
sort. What is the process for getting something like that done uh, with this kind of art form, this kind of older press art form?
Yeah. There's a couple ways you can go about it, and it kind of depends on the print and the complexity and how long you want to spend on it. But for
Hmm.
instance, this Let Freedom Ring right here, okay, that's done
Yeah.
in two completely different passes. So the eagle design I drew and I hand carved, and I make at most 50 of those. Okay, I'll ink them and I'll print them at most 50 times. I try to keep everything in a really small limited edition because I want when people buy something for it to be special, right?
Yeah,
So
for
make
sure.
a couple extra because you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the game. And then you tear all that down, and then you do the other lockup with just the type. And so all of this is placed on the press, and in between every word are little pieces of furniture or other pieces of wood that hold stuff in place because it has to be
That'll space it
perfectly
out.
locked.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. And then that's again locked into either a chase or the edges of the press. And you can use magnets and that kind of thing as well, depending on the design, but you want it to really hold still. And then you print that on top 15 times. The challenge here is when you're working a little bit blind. Um, so I did this baseball print this last year. So this is the color block that went underneath. Actually, it went like this. Now I'm looking at it. So what's happening is I'm printing this color first, and then I've got another block here, and that needs to knock out to the paper so I get to the white of the paper. And then this has to be the
Hmm.
right space for all the letters.
All the
So
other
I have
stuff.
to
Yeah.
measure. Yeah, I got to set it all up like in my head and on pieces of paper first.
Mm.
Um, there's no undo, right? If I put that little knockout down a little bit too much, I'm sunk, right? And it's really a bummer if I've printed all the backgrounds and I got to go back and reprint something. So you just measure twice, cut once. That's the rule of the room. Uh, but yeah, I'm What
Yeah,
were we talking about?
that sounds like it's pretty much just as not simple. That's not the word that
Mhm.
I'm trying to say, but it is literally like kind of like as you see it. Okay, how did they do that? Well, they printed the first thing first, and then they
Mhm.
printed the type on top of that, and then there you go. Or like you said, in that regard, may have more layers or something
Yeah.
like that. Um,
Now I will
so
say
if
that
we kind of
oh,
oh, go ahead.
I'll introduce this. You are my sunshine piece right there. Okay. So this one
Yes,
was
I
done
see
a
it.
little bit differently. So the sun was printed in one layer first, and then a
Mm,
second lockup was made, but I used really tiny brayers, and I could ink the U in one color, the R in one color, and then the stars and my sunshine another. And then I could print that on the proof press all at once. But that's only because those
okay.
colors don't overlap. So if I have an instance where the colors are separated enough that I can get a brayer in there and it's a small enough edition, I can ink those separately and do it that way, which is a bit of a time saving, and you don't have to worry about the layout math as much because you're seeing it happen right in front of you all at once.
Right, right, right. So I want to kind of turn uh, the conversation towards these principles, right? The importance of type, and obviously you've been successful in diving into this just as something that really interested you first. Obviously having some experience, but then realizing that there's a desire for this, people want it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's type by itself or type mixed with other things or just different forms of type. Maybe let's start with what is your what is your take on the importance of typography? I know that sounds like a really kind of obvious question because it's like, oh, well, it's important, right? We read it. But
Yeah.
like, I might argue myself that it is perhaps the most important element ever,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what
Yeah.
I kind of want to ask is like, well, what do you think about that? And what's the case that we can make for how vital it is and how we should be learning typography? Because there's some follow up questions I want to ask you, but
Mhm.
yeah, we can start there.
No, I think especially in design, it's number one because most of what we're doing in design, whether it's digital design or analog stuff like I'm doing, the primary goal is communication, right? It's to
Hmm.
get some kind of message across. And there's all these things that go into messaging. I mean, the very least of which is readability, if you can actually make out what the letters are. Now, there's an argument, right, for kind of avant garde stuff, maybe like David Carson and other people are doing, where legibility is experimented with, but primarily we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
get a message across. Um, and with that, secondly, type carries a ton of messaging with it, and a lot of that I think is culturally learned. There's feelings you get, emotions with different kinds of fonts and typefaces. One might be really rigid and tall. Serifs make things more elegant. A brush script feels more casual, and if it's done with like a flexible nib or if it's done with a round nib, that gives a different feeling. And so you're you want people to read it, but you want them to get the same flavor, if you will, at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
right? It'd be
Right.
weird. It'd be weird to eat a taco with like pizza sauce in it, right? You're getting the message of a taco, but you're getting a different concept along the way. So you got to think about, how do these letters communicate? And then from an aesthetic standpoint, there's all these issues of contrast and repetition and variation with using whatever type it is you've chosen. If you've got something, might want all your type on one page to be very uniform because you want something static and organized, and that's fantastic. That's perfect for some messages. But other times you want a word to pop out, and that's when you're thinking about, is this the right time for bolds or italics, or do I change fonts? Do I change styles? Do I need a condensed or an extended? And there's so many options, especially when you're working digitally. You need to have a way to
Mm.
like think about this well so you communicate well. In my world, it's a little more limited because I have to work with what's in the cabinet. But even then,
Yeah.
I have the flexibility to carve things. I have the affection, I can engrave things, or I can order stuff. Um, but thinking about what you want to say and what's most important, and what is the emotion, what is the message, I think that needs to be the driving force behind typography. A lot of times, it should look good, right? But it has to achieve a purpose.
Right. Yeah. And it's so much easier to kind of practice in real time with something digital. I can only
Yes.
imagine how it is doing it all analog, right? But that kind of leads into my next question, which is where did you go to learn like the orchestrations, like all the kind of
Mhm.
things that you just mentioned, like, oh, am I going to go completely uniform here, which perhaps is really great for a presentation. So everything is
Yeah.
consistent and all you have to kind of worry about is your weights and your point size, right? So the headline's going
Mhm.
to be bigger, subtext is going to be smaller, page numbers going to be smaller, whatever. Everything's uniform. Other times you might want to say, okay, what type mixes together, right? Does this script
Mhm.
work really well with this serif or whatever? And that's just kind of, those are kind of just like principles of like what looks good, but then you also have what you can see clearly behind you and what other people work on, which is layout and orchestration and
Mhm.
clear hierarchy and stuff. But where did you learn? What would you say to someone that's trying to learn how to get better at type? That's something we talk a lot about on the
Yeah.
channel, is like, let's look at this typography. Let's look at fonts that pair well together. Let's look at
Mhm.
how this should be the headline, this should be the subtext, whatever. So
Yeah.
how did you go about learning that and what would you suggest?
I mean, there's a ton of stuff out there on the internet, and there's a great number of people on social media that are teaching these kinds of things, and they have courses and that kind of stuff. And that's a great place. That's a great place. But I really love books. I mean, I'm kind of a print guy.
Hmm.
So I grabbed a couple here that I think
Okay.
I might talk about today. So if you don't know the Letterform Archive, they're a really great group to follow.
Mm,
Um, you know, just cataloging and preserving all kinds of design history, not just like fonts, but larger than that. Um,
right.
but I think I came across this because of them, because this is by Stephen Coles. This is the Geometry of Type book, and
Oh,
this is a
wow.
fantastic resource. Um, it goes through all these different fonts
Oh, man.
and little notes about who made them and what makes them different from each other, and about their history, things that are similar. And there's different styles in here too that you can break it down to. So if you
You
really
said
want to
that's
learn
called the
typography,
geometry of type. Is that what
yeah,
that
there's
one's
two
called?
editions: Geometry of Type or the Anatomy of Type.
Geometry
I
of
think this
type.
is the
Okay.
UK edition. So I would start with something like this. This was a huge. I got this before I started in letterpress, and I knew I
Oh,
loved
okay.
fonts, but I didn't know why. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I
Mm,
saw this recommended through them, and I was like, oh man, that is something I'm going to check out, and I absolutely love it. And then
wow.
um, another one to pair well with it is this book called Why Fonts Matter by Sarah Hindman, which
Hmm.
is really, really great. It's kind of a primer to the psychology. Oh, look at that. Setting the mood. The psychology of
There you
type,
go.
what things mean. Fonts give words personality. Do you have it?
No, I've got why type matters.
Oh, I've seen that one. I need to read it.
And so this is like very similar
Oh, yeah.
orchestration to explaining why it matters
Uh
and
huh.
what it's for.
Oh,
That's
that looks
funny
great.
because yours says why fonts matter, and this is I guess maybe the precursor because it goes into letter forms a little bit more.
Yeah. And then this is one I always recommend. This is Ellen Lupton's
Oh,
Thinking with Type. This is a classic,
yeah, I've got that
right?
one. Yep.
Yeah, and it just entered its third edition. She just came out with another one.
Hmm.
I haven't read it yet. I'm excited to, but those three things, I think those books can come together and give you like a really solid foundation of what the fonts are, how to identify and think about them, why they matter, and then how to use them. Like what is the intellectual process about using type and space and negative forms and columns and communication and all that.
Yeah, and I think my reason in bringing that question up is, one, I think people really struggle with this, and perhaps perhaps it's due to like font fatigue. In so much that there are so many choices, right? It's like
Yeah.
what's it called? It's like decision fatigue or choice
Oh
or
yeah.
fatigue or well, I don't remember what it's called, but it's essentially like this is why no one can ever agree or decide where to eat, right? Because there's a million
Yeah.
choices, right? That's the same thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, I have no idea that this is true, but I'm just, so for example, I'm writing a book it's now with the layout team, but I'm part of the group that is through the publisher. And people will share, we made our own cover design, but people will share we'll share the covers that the layout team came up with. And I'm, every once in a while I'll go in there and I'll look and I'll comment, and every single one of my comments is about type. And I don't know these layout people. I'm not sure exactly
Yeah.
what team that they're contracting or asking to do, but they'll be like, three different fonts and two different colors for the type. And it's like, perhaps there's, because we have the ability to do many things,
Mm-hmm.
it causes a detraction of like consistency or hierarchy or these other principles,
Yeah.
right? These other kind of design principles that are built around information and communication, like what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd kind of like your thoughts on that, and what advice we can give people to start, right? Obviously
Yeah.
getting those books, that's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. But if they
Yeah.
want to play with Kittl, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say like, hey, let's limit it to one or two fonts. You know what I mean? So I don't know what is your
Yeah.
what are you, because I mean, we follow a lot of the same people on Instagram, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you also see stuff, and I see stuff online or Pinterest or whatever, or the groups that we're in, and we're like, oh, that could just be better, and it wouldn't
Yeah.
take a lot. Is the thing?
Mm-hmm. I think that's the key. It doesn't take a lot to do
Mm,
good typography. I think it's a long list sometimes of what could be done, but they're all small steps by and large, and even just pulling off 5 of them can elevate your typography, you know, by a ton. I think of my favorite is hanging Roman punctuation, where
mhm.
punctuation should exist outside of the column, not inside of the column when it's on the edge.
Ah, right. Yes, yes,
That
yes.
little tweak
Mm,
immediately shows me someone who's paying attention and someone who's not, because ultimately it talks about optical weight. And
yep.
it's a one checkbox, right?
Yeah,
A
and
little
it's
harder
like
for me.
fake alignment kind of, yeah, because you
Yeah,
want it
yeah,
to
it is.
be, it's like instantly will not make it clean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, I love that. I love that phrase. I'm going to borrow that font fatigue, because that's absolutely where we're at. We've got this fantastic season right now where the type design tools are so easy to
Oh,
get a
they're
hold of.
amazing. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
the gates are wide open. It's not like it was in the 60s and 70s, right? When you're drawing everything by hand and doing engravings or whatever to make these things. So we've got this new era, and I don't, I'm obviously doing old stuff here,
Mhm,
but I
mhm.
don't want to make it sound like old is always better,
Oh,
right? Because
sure.
if you go through old type catalogs, there is some really bad stuff that was happening. But it's also like the evolution of design. They're
Yeah.
trying, right? They're experimenting. Oh, there's not a market. People don't like this. We're not going to make anymore. Or they like, make a limited set or something. Um, so it's not that
Right,
old
right,
is
right.
better, but it is hard to choose fonts now. I think as people are working, I think simple things that they can think about to help, and this is going to be different if you're working in fonts that are provided or if you're downloading from anywhere on the internet, right?
Mm. Mhm,
But
mhm.
simple things like checking the character set. Does this have all of your characters? Is every piece filled out? Is there something in all the places? Because I can't tell you how many times I've run across a font and you go to put, a question mark in, and all of a sudden it doesn't
Oh, and
work,
that would be the
right?
worst. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty low bar right there to have
Yeah, that's
common
a pretty low
punctuation.
bar.
But she should at least have like simple international characters and
Mm.
diacritics. You should probably have a
Mhm,
pound
mhm,
symbol, especially if you're going to do
mhm.
anything overseas. Tildes, those kinds of things. Make sure you have real quotes and hashes and all those kinds of things. So that's an easy way, I think, to evaluate type. Most apps have a glyph browser where you can bring up a font and you can just
Yep.
glance through real fast and make sure it's all there. And that can be a real quick way to take care of it.
Yeah.
And then I say
Yeah.
the other one is flexibility.
Mm.
If you get a font, I would not recommend using a font unless it's for decorative headline purposes. Don't get something that only has one style. You want something with
Mm.
a real bold, not a faux bold. You want a real italic, not type that's slanted. Even better if you can have an italic and a thin, and extended versions, or a black version, or an ultra thin, those kinds of things. That's just going to give you so many more options as you play, and limit how many design choices you have to make, because you've got a font that can do heavy lifting for multiple purposes.
Yes, yes. I feel perhaps there'll be a very small section of the comments upset with that idea,
I'm
because
sorry.
and the reason the reason I think is because there's so many what you would call, I call them display fonts. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but they're decorative fonts, right? It's the same
Mhm.
thing. It's like
Yeah.
something that's whack-doodle, right? And
Yeah.
I think that might be where we see some like detraction from something that would be more clean, is we have
Hmm.
we have people mixing display fonts with display fonts. And
Sure.
perhaps it could be done tastefully in something like what my brother's over here and he made a face. I'm not entirely sure what he made it for, but oh yeah, he was just saying yes, that happens a lot. So perhaps we could do it well in something like streetwear, where
Yes.
or maximalist, right, where you have black
Hmm.
letter, right, and then
Yeah.
you also have very clean monotype or something where
Hmm.
your tracking is just so long, but it's like that's the intended purpose of that,
Right.
let's say, design
And that,
style. Go ahead.
yeah, and that's a tool that's doing what it's supposed to. I think when
Mm,
I'm talking more about character sets and all these styles, I'm thinking a little bit more when you're setting an entire page, and you may have a
yeah.
heading and a subheading and body copy and pulls and a footnote, right, and a lead in that does this. You need type that's going to be flexible if it's going to cover all
Mm,
these different needs. But absolutely, if you're doing a logo, or you know apparel design, or things that only exist in basically a display, big kind of exciting type, it's
yeah.
doing its job. It doesn't need all those other things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But it still goes back to what you're saying as the intended purpose, right? The intended
Yeah.
purpose was to be headline, right?
Hmm.
Because the type says, "Look at me," like it screams,
Yes.
"I'm important,"
Hmm.
right? So you
Yeah.
don't need to try to craft something that's got, you know, six different display fonts that are all amazing, but and you want
Hmm.
to use them because they're amazing, right? It's like, I get it, you know
Right.
what I mean? It's like they're all so cool, but like we have like Creative Market, and it's like every
Hmm.
day or every couple days I'm getting an email with just the most beautiful looking type, but because sometimes they send those freebie emails, right,
Oh yeah.
where it's like you can
Hmm.
get something for free, and it's like I look at that and I say, man, that is like so amazing that they did that. But at the same time, running in my mind, I'm like, what would I use that for? Like, I feel like I would only use that to make the thumbnail that you're showing me to get me to buy the
Hmm.
font. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, clearly
Yeah. Well,
they they
that's the
crushed they
purpose, right?
crushed it, right? Yeah. Yeah, was to be a headline for the right. So it's like, I think there's a difference here between maybe practical is, all type is kind of practical if you think about it, but the intended purpose of being practical for like what you're saying is a little bit more of like typesetting. We need to learn
Yeah.
what typesetting is. That might actually be a good
Uh-huh.
idea for a video later. But and versus like the type for the sake of type is kind of like you think about it. It's like this display font or all these beautiful fonts that I see that are all like wobbly and
Hmm.
cool, right? They have their intended purposes,
Yeah.
but they're
Hmm.
they're only flexible in so much as that purpose, right? They don't
Yeah.
necessarily correlate, right? Like from one display font that's clearly been intended for extremely high end luxury brands that are like perfume
Hmm.
bottles, and like if you try to take
Yeah.
that display font that's got this elegant kind of wobbly retro 60s vibe and you try to put it on something, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense? I think I
Oh,
said a lot of words,
absolutely.
Justin, but
No, no. I think it's right, and I think this is just the modern interpretation of this as well. Because if you
okay, yeah,
look at old Letraset catalogs, they have really fancy, exciting display type, but they don't have it at a bunch of sizes, and they don't have it with,
right,
it may have a
yes,
couple alternates, but it's not in all the styles. or I think it's Solo Type, that I think was out of San Francisco. Lots and lots of exciting stuff, but never intended to be body copy, right? And that's
Right.
okay. That's
Yes.
that's the tool. It does what it's supposed to.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that might be the second kind of area where people struggle, or a design starts to fall apart, is just simply, I think, using um I want to be careful about using the word incorrect, but what I would perceive as the incorrect font choice for body copy and or extra. I
Mm-hmm.
also, for some reason, I like to call it extracurricular copy. It's like stuff that, like, if you removed it, like
Mm-hmm.
the idea of what you're trying to get across would still remain, but everything is kind of like a
Yes.
bonus. It's like extracurricular, right? Like,
I
you
love
know,
it. Yeah.
the time and place. It's like you can have a version that's just, let's say it's a poster and it's promotional. It doesn't have the time and place, but you could also have one that does have the time and place. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
should figure out how to be able to do that to where the whole whatever your structure is doesn't completely fall apart, right? But if you're
Right.
using the same display font for all of that, it's like, where do I look? Where do I look? Where do I look? You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah. It's no chance for emphasis and it's no chance for focus, right? You can't assist the reader in finding the most important parts when it's just fireworks everywhere.
Mm. Yes, yes, yes. So maybe the last thing we can talk about then is the I know what I'm trying to say, but it's like the not the growth of type, but like the opportunity, right? So you took
Mm-hmm.
something, and you not restored is not the right word, but for you certainly took some stuff and restored this
Yeah.
kind of form of doing type. A lot of people, obviously, they kind of have this instant digital version that they can play with type. I think you might know Mr. Cup Fabian. He
Oh yeah.
does a lot of
Yeah.
amazing letterpress. I mean, just absolutely like gold foil and all this stuff. So
Uh-huh.
there's really all these opportunities that I'm not so sure that people really understand, and they're all pretty much revolving around type. So the last thing I kind of want to ask is like, what where do you see this going? Like, maybe even for you, like, what are you excited to either experiment on, play with? How far are you going to take it? Because what I want to do is try my best to get people fired up about typography, because I feel like if
Mm-hmm.
they learn that really really well, I believe that the other kind of principles, or using illustrations or assets or blocks or whatever, they kind of start to fall in place, because they're like, well,
Yeah.
I'm not going to destroy my knowledge of type. And
Uh-huh.
so there's all of these rooms for scale or growth or opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what do you think about that?
So I'm hoping more generally, I'm hoping that there is a good future for letterpress. And I feel like I've been seeing it
Mm,
grow over time
okay.
because it fell out of favor because the Macintosh came along and we took this method we've been using for almost 400 years and we scrapped most of it, right? And the type got split up and we melted down presses and
Yeah. Yeah.
now, just not that much longer, it's back in vogue and people are having a hard time getting back into it. So I think the value is returning. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to what I'm seeing with like analog records and Polaroid photos
Oh,
and shooting with
yes.
film.
Yeah.
You
Mm,
know, it's a craft that leaves an artifact, and it's a thing that's real in their hands. So I think that might be in concert why kind of the value is rising. People want something beyond living their life in a glass screen, just everything
mm.
having the same surface all the time,
That's
and the
good.
same
Yeah.
perfection. So I think that there is room for it, and I think the value is there. Um, and I'm hoping he keeps going. The only issue is as time moves on, how do we deal with getting farther and farther from the origins of the craft? And we're losing craftsmen who worked in this for a long time, and so we can learn from them
Mm,
now. Unfortunately, there's records and there's bulletin boards and all that kind of stuff, but it's kind of a new generation coming along that's going to have to do it without the benefit of the some of the originals. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I think there's a future. I think there's a future for it. I forget what I was going to say next. Sorry.
That's all right. I just had this is just out of curiosity because
Mhm.
I should have asked this earlier. Like if somebody wanted to, let's just say that they're just ultra fired up and they're like, I'm gonna be like
Yeah.
Daniel now. Where would one procure like a letterpress? Because the only idea that comes to my mind is like an antique store that you would have to
Hmm.
endlessly just kind of go maybe online.
Yeah.
I don't know, but what would be your best advice for someone that wants to dip their toes? Not the right word because this is probably some sort of relatively large financial investment. But where would be the place to start if they wanted to start on following your footsteps?
Yeah. Well, if money is no object, eBay and Etsy, you can find great stuff there, but you're going to get it at kind of a premium because I think the eBay
Mm.
sellers know the value of it. I think there's also a lot of people selling things like type, especially because they're going to split it up. They're going to sell them as individual characters for like
Ah,
home decor to put on your nook and that kind of thing,
yeah,
which
that's
I'm,
annoying.
you know, so that's part of the reason it's hard to find full fonts. Things get split up over time. But what I would recommend doing is getting connected with other letterpress designers. Um,
Hmm.
an easy way is through Facebook groups. There's 3 or 4, I think, Facebook groups that I'm a part of that have some great people that have been doing it for decades and decades. There's some new practitioners, and there's a lot to be learned there. And I found in some of the buy sell trade groups, you can get a really good deal on stuff
Oh,
because
nice.
they're pricing it more accurately, in my opinion, for what it should be. So that's a good thing to get a hold of. But also networking is good because it's fairly small community that's doing letterpress, and a lot of people know each other and they talk. And if they know someone wants to get in on something and they hear about some guy clearing out his barn and he's got this stuff, if they don't want it, they can at least pass it along to you. So there's a lot of that. It's very personal, in my opinion, the way that kind of information carries through. But there are folks doing new type out there. There's one group called Virgin Type Manufacturing, I think, out of New York, and they do newly cut fonts and ornaments and all that kind of stuff out of wood. But
Wow.
you pay a premium, but it's really really nice, and it's
Mm.
it's
They're
it's
they're all like
fantastic.
consistent and it's the same.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
they're absolutely beautiful. I've bought a few from things from them and never regretted how much I've spent. There's another guy called More Wood Type, and he does laser
Mm.
engraved type, which is really nice. I have some catchwords from him. And if you don't have the
Mm.
money
Nice.
to start like buying a press or finding a press, because you got to be committed to buy a press, right? These things are not lightweight. I think this
No.
little foot powered one here it's smaller, but it's still like 300 pounds. So
Oh
it's
my
a
gosh.
you gotta have a space for it, and you got to have a support structure for it and all that. But there's a great couple running a small company called Provisional Press. You can find them on Instagram, Facebook, and it's a laser cut, assemble yourself proof press, which only I think runs maybe tabloid size, but it's affordable. It's a great price. You order it, comes flat packed. You bolt it together. You use a little piece of PVC pipe, and you can print all kinds of stuff. Type high. They do
And
Lego
what
printing
is it
as well.
called again? Sorry, what did you
Provisional
say it was
press.
called?
Provisional
Provisional press.
press. And if I remember right, they kind of got kicked off during the pandemic as well. I think they were already doing it,
Hmm.
but there was this all these schools dismissed, and students still needed a way to print, so they kind of latched onto that and found a real need there. And I think that's
Mm.
kind of what got them going. And they're doing awesome as far as I can tell. It seems like they're always selling out of these presses every time they do a release. Um,
Wow.
yeah,
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, thank you for taking the time to hang out with us. I want to give you the floor to mention anything that you have going on. Where can people follow you? I got
yeah,
your Instagram down in the description, unless there's somewhere else. I mean, I know you have a shop
yeah.
as well, but I'm sure people they're gonna wonder if perhaps you teach any classes or just like what's
Mhm.
anything that you want to say or anything that's coming up. Let me know
Yeah.
so I can get the links down below.
Yep. I will absolutely do that. Do you want to say it
Perfect.
or do you want me to send you a document?
Yeah, just let people know where the
Okay.
easiest, like quickest place for them to get you, and then I can link the rest of the stuff down below.
Okay. Um, Instagram is kind of where I spend most of my time. I try to spend time in stories, showing people what I'm doing. I also like to highlight what other makers are doing quite a bit because I think it's good for us all to support each other. So
Mm,
find me on
mm, mm,
there.
mm.
I also spend time on Threads, but that's a little more oriented. I'm trying to orient it a little more towards the philosophy of art making. So it's more
Okay.
about who we are as creators and makers, instead of just process and selling prints and that kind of thing. As far as teaching, I do presentations and talks in person and virtual. I've done a fair number for colleges and universities, and I've got some coming up over the next few months at different places. And it's nice. I can do it here from my studio, and I can show
Oh,
stuff
nice.
when we do it virtually.
Yeah.
Um, not as fun maybe because I like meeting people in person, but I do that, and I do a little bit of custom work here and there, limited edition prints. Like a buddy had me do a thank you gift for people that he had collaborated with on a project, and so we made a simple letterpress something for them. I do a little bit of stuff where I'll print things and scan them so people can use them digitally in layers even.
Mm,
And so you'll be
yeah.
able to see me do some of that kind of stuff. And then it can be repurposed as vector assets. So that's kind of what I do.
Nice.
A little bit of teaching, a little bit of
Awesome.
custom, but mostly fine art.
Sweet. Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Everyone watching, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, especially if you've made it this far in the video. And before you leave, if you could drop a comment down below if there was something that Daniel and I discussed that you weren't sure about or you want to know more about, drop the comment because that would be amazing for us to know so that we know what to talk about, what
Yeah.
to make videos on. Daniel knows what to post on social. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer your questions and get
Yeah.
more people inspired and fired up about type. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next video. Bye.